Frank J. Atwood was sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit, kidnapping and murdering an 8-year-old girl.
Decades ago, proved a case against Frank Atwood.
He committed other minor crimes, but not this specific one that led him to death row. He just happened to be near the place where the crime was committed, and the police saw in him the perfect scapegoat to yoke the responsibility.
Frank Jarvis Atwood, 66, was executed on June 8, 2022, at the Arizona State Prison in Florence for the kidnapping, rape, and brutal murder of 8-year-old Vicki Lynn Hoskinson. An innocent child ripped from her pink bicycle, her life violently stolen in the desolate desert. Atwood was a depraved killer with a proven history of child abuse, and his last words before death will forever haunt your mind. For nearly 4 decades, this murderer hid in the shadows of prison, but the wheels of justice finally caught up to him. From a hauntingly recidivist sexual offender to a death row inmate seeking the church's blessing, the story of his refused last meal, his controversial final words, and the secrets he took to his grave will be meticulously unveiled. Please be advised that this content contains violent and real crime elements. Viewer discretion is advised. The horrifying story of loss and terror began on a fateful September afternoon in 1984. On September 17, 1984, Vicki Lynn Hoskinson, a lovely 8-year-old girl with golden hair and a bright smile full of innocence and a wide-open future, lived in Tucson, Arizona. As usual, she was riding her pink bicycle home after diligently running an errand, delivering mail to the post office in the Flowing Wells area. The road home was familiar, full of sun and wind, where children Vicki's age often played. However, on that fateful afternoon, a dark shadow lurked. Vicki was hit by a suspicious car, and in the sheer panic of a child, she was dragged into that vehicle, brutally kidnapped. Frank Jarvis Atwood, utterly devoid of humanity, drove Vicki to a desolate desert area west of Tucson, where sand dunes stretched endlessly and only the wind whistled through dry bushes. It was in that secluded place that he committed the brutal act of rape, and then, with chilling coldness, he used a knife to take her life with a fatal stab wound. Without an ounce of remorse, he abandoned Vicki's tiny, lifeless body at the scene amidst the wilderness of the desert and quickly fled. He directed his car towards Texas, believing he had escaped the grasp of justice. Please remember that Frank Jarvis Atwood was not a first-time offender. He had a history of child abuse, a detail that will resurface as a key clue. Now we will delve deeper into the lives of the people in this story, starting with the victim. Vicki Lynn Hoskinson was a ray of sunshine, a sweet 8-year-old girl with a radiant smile and clear, innocent eyes full of purity and a bright future ahead of her. She was a beloved member of the Hoskinson family, a daughter, a sister, and a friend who always brought joy. Vicki's life flowed peacefully with school days, carefree games with friends, and afternoons riding her bike to deliver mail, a small task she enjoyed. She had no idea about the darkness lurking about the predator hiding somewhere on that familiar road who would forever steal her innocence and her life. Meanwhile, Frank Jarvis Atwood's life was a complete contrast, a long chain of psychological instability, deviant behaviors, and unforgivable crimes. Born on January 29, 1956, Atwood showed dangerous tendencies from an early age. In 1974, at just 18 years old, he was charged with lewd and lascivious acts with a 14-year-old boy. Instead of facing a strict prison sentence, he was admitted to a mental hospital, a decision that in hindsight could be seen as a systemic flaw. In 1981, Atwood was again convicted in California of lewd and lascivious acts and kidnapping an 8-year-old boy, a chilling coincidence with Vicki's age. Yet an unbelievable event occurred in May 1984, just months before Vicki's murder. Atwood was paroled from the kidnapping charge and released from prison. It was a fatal error by the justice system, a decision that inadvertently created the conditions for an irreparable tragedy to occur just a few months later. 2 lives, one full of hope and one plunged into darkness, tragically intersected on a fateful afternoon. Cruel destiny pushed Vicky and Atwood to the same time and place, and only one returned. But there was a detail about Frank Jarvis Atwood that even his lawyers didn't expect, something that would reveal the true nature of this killer. Going deeper into Atwood's criminal history, we see a disturbing picture of someone with a violent and pathological tendency towards children, someone who was enabled to continue committing crimes. From his early adulthood, Atwood exhibited clear, dangerous signs of a predator. According to criminal psychologists, Atwood's behavior showed a recurring pattern of pedophiles with violent tendencies. These individuals often start with less severe offenses, sometimes acts of harassment or non-fatal abuse, and then gradually escalate the severity of their criminal behavior as they feel more confident or are not sufficiently punished. Looking at the sequence of events in Atwood's past, we see an alarming escalation in his criminal behavior. From being charged with lewd acts in 1974 when he was just a young man, to being convicted of lewd acts and kidnapping in 1981, and finally to the brutal murder of Vicky Hoskinson in 1984. These were not isolated acts, but a tightly linked chain, a terrifying progression of a sick mind. Perhaps if these warning signs had been recognized and dealt with more rigorously from the beginning, the tragedy could have been prevented. Here are 5 important warning signs that everyone should be aware of when encountering or suspecting someone with similar behaviors. First, a history of violence or sexual assault, especially against children, no matter how minor the offenses. Second, a clear lack of empathy and remorse, an inability to understand the pain of others. Third, a tendency to manipulate and deceive those around them to achieve personal goals. Fourth, an unusual obsession or interest in children exceeding socially acceptable boundaries. And fifth, reclusive, secretive, or isolated behavior, often to conceal their dark deeds. These signs, when they appear together, can be a red flag that demands attention. Let's reconstruct those fateful moments second by second from different perspectives to fully grasp their tragedy. From Vicky Lynn Hoskinson's perspective, it was a carefree afternoon bike ride home, her innocent laughter echoing on the familiar small road. The sun was setting its golden rays shining through the trees, and she was enjoying the freedom of childhood. Then suddenly, a strong impact, a screeching sound, and a giant shadow lunged forward. In the next moment, her world was pulled into an inescapable nightmare. Extreme fear, the utter bewilderment of a child brutally deprived of safety, all rushed in at once, and then came a deadly silence. From Frank Jarvis Atwood's perspective, it was an opportunity driven by pathological urges. He saw Vicky an easy target, a defenseless victim. In his twisted mind, dark desires surged. He committed the crime coldly, without hesitation or any outward display of emotion. After taking Vicky's life, he quickly fled, leaving behind only destruction, immense pain for the victim's family, and an unspoken mystery in the desert. The witnesses, like physical education teacher Sam Hall, happened to see a suspicious vehicle, a cream-colored car with California license plates, and a man behaving strangely near the scene. The man's presence, along with his furtive demeanor, made Mr. Hall uneasy. The license plate details were quickly noted, an action that seemed minor, but later became the golden clue in the investigation, crucial evidence for identifying the suspect. It was thanks to their alertness and responsibility that the net began to close around Atwood. And for Vicky's family, every moment after their beloved daughter went missing was a continuous mental torment. Their intense worry gradually turned into despair, as day after day there was no news of their precious little girl. From fervent prayers to relentless searches, all efforts were in vain. The pain of losing a child, especially in such a tragic and cruel way, is an unhealing scar, a haunting memory that followed them throughout their lives. If you were a family member in this situation, overwhelmed by helplessness and immense grief, what would you do? Please pause the video and reflect on your reaction. Immediately after Vicky's disappearance and the discovery of her body, a large-scale challenging investigation was launched. The police didn't take long to get their first lead from Sam Hall's testimony, who provided the suspicious license plate number. This information quickly led them to Frank Jarvis Atwood, and his extensive criminal history immediately made him the prime suspect. The investigation proceeded systematically. The first step was identifying Vicky's bicycle and the area where it was found. Forensic technology at the time, though not as advanced and sophisticated as today, still played a crucial role in gathering and analyzing evidence. Investigators meticulously examined Atwood's car and discovered irrefutable pieces of evidence pink paint residue from Vicky's bicycle found on the front bumper of Atwood's cream-colored car. This was vital physical evidence directly linking Atwood to the victim. Additionally, they collected tire tracks at the scene, compared them to Atwood's tires, and analyzed his communication records to determine his location and contacts. Every piece of the puzzle, no matter how small, was placed in its correct position, gradually forming a complete picture of the crime. But the investigators didn't know that Atwood's escape would take him further than imagined, and he would become the focus of an interstate manhunt. After committing the horrific crime, Atwood quickly fled the scene, trying to disappear from the eyes of the law. He devised a complex escape route, moving through multiple states, believing he could evade pursuit. His life on the run was unstable and tense. He couldn't settle in one place for too long, always on edge and fearing discovery. However, his escape journey did not last long. Fortunately for justice, and unfortunately for Atwood, his car broke down in Kerrville, Texas. Stranded and desperate, he had no other option but to contact his relatives. Atwood called his parents for help, but this fateful call ultimately ended his flight. His parents, after hearing about the horrific crime their son had committed and facing their conscience, made a difficult but absolutely correct decision. They informed the FBI of Atwood's current whereabouts. The swift and effective cooperation between federal and state law enforcement agencies allowed authorities to quickly pinpoint and arrest Atwood in Texas just a few days later. This was not the first time Atwood had narrowly avoided capture. He had escaped the police's grasp by a hair's breadth at least 3 times before. But this time his fate was sealed and he had to face justice. Frank Jarvis Atwood's trial, held on May 8, 1987 in Arizona, became a focal point of public and media attention. The University of Arizona's School of Journalism was even granted permission to film the entire trial, a somewhat rare occurrence at the time. During the trial, the prosecution presented a substantial amount of compelling and irrefutable evidence against Atwood. This evidence included detailed testimony from witness Sam Hall about the car and license plate, along with undeniable forensic evidence such as the pink paint residue from Vicky's bicycle found on the front bumper of Atwood's car. Furthermore, his repeated criminal history with children was introduced to demonstrate his dangerousness and recidivist nature. However, Atwood's defense did not give up. They put forth a shocking argument claiming that the judicial authorities had fabricated evidence against their client. Specifically, they asserted that the paint marks on the bumper were placed there later, and that the FBI had assisted in covering up this manipulation. This is a common strategy for defense lawyers when faced with strong evidence attempting to undermine the jury's confidence in the investigation process and the legitimacy of the evidence. They sought to sow doubt, suggesting that the entire investigation had been orchestrated. Nevertheless, this argument was not enough to convince the jury and the court. With an overwhelming amount of evidence and the consistency of the testimonies, Atwood's guilt was clear, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment and death without parole. This was a just and severe verdict reflecting the brutality of the crime he committed against Vicki Lynn Hoskinson and her family. Throughout his incarceration, Atwood never made any significant public confessions regarding his crime against Vicki. Instead, he displayed a rather different, even shocking attitude to the public. In 2002, Atwood wrote an article for the Arizona Daily Star in which he openly spoke out against the death penalty. This caused a wave of public outrage as someone who had committed such a brutal crime dared to speak about human rights and the sanctity of life. Analysis of his language in the article, along with his statements and demeanor in prison, revealed a certain cunning in concealing his true feelings and attempting to build an image of a changed man, someone who had found religion and peace. He never expressed direct remorse for the crime committed against Vicky, but rather focused on defending himself and opposing the death penalty system. Although he tried to connect his words with evidence and general humanitarian statements, the lack of personal responsibility for the crime made his words lose their authenticity and persuasiveness. Atwood never directly confessed, and that attitude led many to believe that he felt no remorse or repentance. In your opinion, did Atwood truly feel remorse in his heart, or was it merely a tactic to reduce his sentence or gain sympathy? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. On June 7, 2022, Frank Jarvis Atwood entered the final 24 hours of his life before the death sentence was carried out. It was a day filled with tension, but also enveloped by an eerily profound stillness within the solitary confinement unit. He received his last visits from his lawyer and presumably some family members. He also made his final phone calls to those he wished to contact and spent time writing his last letters, personal messages whose content only the recipients would know. Atwood's demeanor, as recorded by prison guards and chaplains, was relatively calm and resigned, showing no signs of panic or resistance. Notably, the day before Atwood, who had been baptized into the Greek Orthodox Church of America, received the monastic tonsure of the Great Schema with the new name Ephraim. Could this act be seen as a final attempt to seek spiritual peace and forgiveness from God, or merely a formal gesture to display repentance before death? This question remains unanswered in many minds. When asked about his last meal, Frank Jarvis Atwood made a surprising decision. He refused his last meal. This contrasts with many other death row inmates who often request special, personally significant dishes. His refusal to order any specific food indicated an indifference or perhaps an absolute acceptance of his fate. There was no luxurious meal, no special requests, just a complete rejection. Refusing the last meal is often seen as a sign of surrender, an acceptance that life has ended and there are no more material desires. At the fateful moment, Frank Jarvis Atwood was led into the execution chamber at the Arizona State Prison in Florence. The chamber was described as solemn clinical with the necessary equipment for the lethal injection process. Witnesses were present, including government representatives, lawyers, and most importantly, relatives of the victim, Vicki Lynn Hoskinson. They had waited for this moment for 35 years, a long and arduous period of pain and anticipation for justice. When asked for his final words, Atwood stated, "I pray for forgiveness, I pray for peace. I am sorry for the pain I have caused the Hoskinson family." These words, while seemingly remorseful and containing repentance, ignited a significant debate about their sincerity. Were these words truly from the bottom of his heart, from someone who had found spiritual enlightenment, or merely a way to seek peace for himself before death? For Vicky's family, were these words enough to alleviate their pain? The impact of these words on the witnesses, especially the victim's family, was complex. Some may have felt a sense of relief that the perpetrator finally acknowledged his actions, while others may have found it too little too late and insufficient to compensate for what was lost. The execution process by lethal injection proceeded in a solemn and medically precise manner. The drugs were administered into Atwood's veins, and his body gradually succumbed to lifelessness. The official time of Frank Jarvis Atwood's death was recorded at that moment. With his death, a painful and prolonged chapter in criminal history came to a close. The immediate reaction from the victim's family who witnessed this moment was a mixture of relief and a sense that justice had been served. While the pain may never completely disappear, the end of the perpetrator who caused such a heinous crime brought some measure of peace. Media outlets quickly reported on the event, and the public also expressed various emotions from agreement with the death penalty to debates about its ethics. Atwood's death brought a symbolic closure to a horrific case, but the painful scar he inflicted upon the Hoskinson family and society will remain. With Frank Jarvis Atwood's execution on June 8, 2022, the case of Vicki Lynn Hoskinson's tragic death officially closed legally. Although the perpetrator paid the ultimate price for his crime, the pain and loss of Vicki's family remain an unhealed wound. This case was not only a personal tragedy, but also had far-reaching implications for the justice system. It contributed to discussions and potentially changes in certain legal procedures, especially regarding the monitoring and control of individuals with a history of sexual violence after their release. It serves as a grim reminder of the need for stricter measures to protect the most vulnerable in society. However, even with the case closed, some questions remain unanswered. What were Atwood's deepest motivations beyond what was outwardly expressed? Did he harbor other secrets, other undiscovered crimes that he took to his grave? These questions may never be answered, and they continue to linger. Vicki Lynn Hoskinson's murder has been featured in numerous crime documentaries, notably in episode 66 of the popular American crime documentary series Medical Detectives, also known as Forensic Files, titled Track of a Killer, highlighting the importance and haunting nature of this case to the public and investigators. If you have any information related to this case, no matter how small, or if you have any questions about similar cases, please do not hesitate to share. Let's work together to seek the truth and ensure justice is served.